In 1898, a team of archaeologists opened a hidden chamber in the Valley of the Kings. 7 years later, in a quiet room in Cairo, one of them carefully unwrapped the linen from a pharaoh's face. The king had been dead for over 3,000 years, and when they lifted his eyelids, they froze. Because the eyes of the king of Egypt were not eyes at all. They were onions, two small, perfectly preserved onions, placed there by priests in one of the strangest burial rituals ever discovered. And to understand why, you have to understand something almost nobody knows. There was a time when the most powerful civilization on Earth treated this vegetable as sacred, not as food, as a symbol of eternity itself. This is the story of the onion, the one bulb that fed pharaohs, moved armies, built cities, and quietly became one of the deepest threads in 5,000 years of human history. And by the end, you'll never look at the one sitting in your kitchen the same way again. Before we can walk back into that tomb, we need to answer one question. Where does the onion actually come from? Because for something in nearly every meal you eat, its origin is a mystery. Most researchers now agree on a rough answer. The onion, Allium cepa, was probably first domesticated somewhere in Central Asia. The likely region covers modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Its closest wild relative still grows in those mountains today. That matters, because it means the onion isn't European. It isn't African, it isn't American. It began in a dry, rugged belt of land at the crossroads of the ancient world, and from there, it went everywhere. The best estimates put its domestication between 5,000 and 7,000 years ago. That makes it one of the very first plants humans ever farmed. Picture a small family in a Central Asian valley, 4,000 or 5,000 years before Christ. Winter has stripped their fields. Their grain is running low, and in a cool corner of their storage pit, one thing has survived the season: a basket of small, dry bulbs, something that gives flavor to their bland porridge. Something that seems to fight sickness, something that keeps. That is why the onion spread, fast. By 2500 BC, Sumerian tablets mention onion patches. Chinese gardens grew them. Ancient Indian writings reference them, but no ancient culture would take the onion further than one, and it wasn't for its taste. It was for its shape, because when a priest on the banks of the Nile sliced open an onion and looked at what was inside, he didn't see food, he saw something that changed everything. So here's the real question. Why would a civilization that had gold, incense, cedar, and precious stones choose an onion for the eyes of a king? Picture yourself in Egypt around 3500 BC. The pyramids haven't been built yet. Writing is still new. And in the shadow of the Nile, a priest is cutting into a bulb, staring at its cross-section and thinking about forever. Here's what he sees: a perfect ring, nested inside another ring, nested inside another. To a modern person, that's just biology. But to an Egyptian priest obsessed with the afterlife, that shape looked like the universe itself, a circle within a circle within a circle. Eternity, folded in on itself, with no visible end. And the Egyptians took that seriously. Painted onions appear on the inner walls of tombs. They show up in banquet scenes. They're held out toward the gods in offering scenes. According to some later accounts, priests would even take sacred oaths with a hand placed on an onion. But the real proof of how deep this went is in the graves. When someone important died, they were buried with onions, real ones, whole bulbs, placed with care around the body. Archaeologists have found mummies with onions on the chest, on the pelvis, woven into flower garlands wrapped around the neck. The idea was simple. The onion, symbol of eternal life, would help the dead person live forever. And that brings us to the man in the tomb. His name was Ramses IV. He was a pharaoh of the 20th dynasty. He ruled Egypt for only about 6 years, roughly from 1155 to 1149 BC. His original tomb was robbed in antiquity. So, generations later, Egyptian priests quietly moved his body and hid it inside the tomb of a different pharaoh, Amenhotep II. They laid him with other kings in a secret chamber deep in the rock, and they sealed him away. He stayed there for 3,000 years. In 1898, that hidden chamber was discovered. 7 years later, in 1905, the archaeologist Grafton Elliott Smith carefully unwrapped his body. Smith was an experienced anatomist. He had seen dozens of mummies. But when he examined the face of Ramses IV, he found something he had never seen before. The pharaoh's eye sockets had been packed with 2 small onions, not stones, not glass, not resin, onions, placed under his eyelids to give his face a lifelike shape. His nostrils had been plugged with onion skin, and nothing else in the entire record of Egyptian mummification is quite like it. Ramses IV is the only pharaoh known to have been buried with onions for eyes. Think about what that image contains. A man once treated as divine, hidden from grave robbers by frightened priests, moved from tomb to tomb across generations, reduced in the end to a fragile body wrapped in linen, and still protected by two ordinary bulbs. Now, the onion didn't only accompany Egypt's kings into death, it may also have fed the workers who built their monuments. Around 450 BC, the Greek historian Herodotus visited the Great Pyramid of Giza. He talked to the priests. He wrote down what they told him. And he claimed there was an inscription on the pyramid listing exactly how much the pharaoh had spent to feed the workers, on radishes, onions, and garlic. Modern scholars believe his interpreters got the translation wrong. That inscription probably said something else entirely. But here's the fascinating part. Even if Herodotus was misled about that specific inscription, other archaeological evidence supports the core claim. Onion residues turn up in the settlements where the pyramid workers lived. Now imagine one of them, a man waking before sunrise, dust already in his throat. He gets a ration of coarse bread, a jug of beer, a raw onion, and a bulb of garlic. That's the fuel. He'll haul stone until the sun goes down. The same plant sitting in the eye sockets of his god king is sitting in the palm of his hand, sacred in the tomb, ordinary in the hand of a man dying to build one. And this obsession went so deep it survived Egypt itself. The book of Numbers, in the Old Testament, describes the Israelites wandering in the desert after escaping slavery. They're hungry, they're tired, and they cry out for the food they left behind. In Numbers chapter 11 verse 5, they name it. Fish, cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. Out of everything a person could miss about a lost home, the Bible names the onion. That's how deep into Egyptian daily life this little bulb had gone. But Egypt was only the beginning, because as trade routes opened, the onion crossed the Mediterranean, and its sacred reputation was about to be turned into a theory of physical power. Around 500 BC, in ancient Greece, athletes are preparing for the Olympic Games, and they're eating something strange, pounds of it, every day. Greek trainers believed onions had a special power, that they could balance the blood, that they could make a man lighter and stronger. So before the Games, Olympic athletes gorged on onions, drank onion juice by the cup, and, in one of the strangest training rituals in history, rubbed raw onions on their bodies before they competed, because they believed the onion transferred its strength into the muscles. When Rome conquered Greece, that belief crossed the sea, and it entered the Colosseum. Roman gladiators were rubbed down with onions before combat, in the same belief that had once trained Olympic athletes. Onions were part of the gladiators' daily porridge. Roman soldiers ate them on campaign. Roman legions carried onion seeds across the empire and planted them wherever they marched. And then came the man who made the onion a medicine. Pliny the Elder was a Roman naturalist, a soldier, a scholar. He wrote a massive encyclopedia called Natural History, the first serious attempt to catalog everything known about the world. And when Pliny got to onions, he went on for pages. Pliny recommended onions for poor vision, for dog bites, and for dysentery. His prescription for weak eyesight was especially memorable. If you couldn't see clearly, the treatment was to sniff a raw onion until you cried, and then rub the juice into your eyes. That's not a joke. That was medical advice from the most respected scientist in the Roman Empire. Pliny would die in 79 AD, when Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried Pompeii. And centuries later, when archaeologists excavated the ruins, they found something remarkable. Planting cavities in the soil, consistent with onion beds. The bulbs had rotted away long ago, but they had left telltale shapes in the ground, exactly where Pliny had described the region's onion gardens growing. Then something happened that should have ended the story. Rome collapsed, the great empire fell, cities emptied, trade routes closed. Europe entered the long, dark centuries we call the Middle Ages. The empire that carried the onion across Europe was gone, but the crop it spread remained. In medieval Europe, three foods carried much of the ordinary population through the year: beans, cabbage, and onions. For most peasants, most of the time, that was the reliable base of the diet. And of the three, the onion was often the most valued, because it preserved through winter. It flavored bland grain, and it seemed to heal. In fact, onions became so valuable in the Middle Ages that they were used as money. Yes, money. Historical records show medieval peasants sometimes paid rent in onions. Landlords accepted them as legal payment. Bags of onions were given as wedding gifts. When a young couple married in medieval France or England, part of what the bride brought to the marriage could be a supply of onions. It sounds absurd today, but at the time it made complete sense. Onions kept, onions fed, onions healed. In a world where coins were scarce, real value came from things that lasted. Then, in 1665, the city of London was hit by the Great Plague. Tens of thousands died, and in the fear and desperation of that year, a folk belief spread through the streets. If you took a peeled onion and left it beside a sick person, that onion would absorb the disease from the air. Imagine a family, kneeling by the bed of a dying mother, placing a peeled onion on her table as their last, hopeless prayer. There was no antibiotic, there was no germ theory, there was only what people had trusted for 5,000 years, and that trust ran on this small bulb. While Europe was pinning its hopes on onions, the crop was preparing for its longest journey, across the Atlantic. On his first voyage in 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean and, according to later records, noted an absence he found strange. He didn't see the cultivated onions Europeans knew from home. So on his second voyage, he packed his ships with what Europeans considered essential: livestock, seed, and among them, onion seeds. In 1494, on the island of Hispaniola, his crew planted onions in New World soil for the first time. From there, the crop spread. Pilgrims later brought onions on the Mayflower. American colonists planted them along the Atlantic coast. The founding fathers grew them at Mount Vernon and Monticello. Within 2 centuries, the same bulb that Egyptian priests had painted on tomb walls was being planted in a Virginia garden. And here's a fact almost no American knows. One of the largest cities in the United States is named after an onion: Chicago. The name comes from a Miami, Illinois word, sometimes rendered as Chicaque. Linguists debate the exact translation. The plant it refers to is a pungent wild allium, something between an onion, a garlic, and a leek. Whatever it was, it grew in enormous quantities along the banks of the river that runs through the city. When French explorers passed through the area in the late 1600s, they wrote the local word down, and their spelling eventually became Chicago. So the next time you fly into O'Hare, remember, you are landing in a city named, quite literally, for the smell of a wild onion. By the time of the American Civil War, onions were more than food. They were military strategy. Both armies used them to treat wounds and prevent scurvy in camps. And according to a widely repeated story, in 1864, General Ulysses S. Grant sent a message to the War Department in Washington that read, "I will not move my army without onions." The exact wording is disputed. It doesn't appear in Grant's official papers, and the earliest printed version surfaces decades after the war. But the story survived for a reason. Because Army supply records show that onions really did travel with the men who moved that war. Picture one of those soldiers, a boy of 20, 1,000 miles from home, camped in the mud. His feet are rotting inside his boots. Half his company has dysentery. And then, in the twilight, someone opens a shipment crate, and the smell of onions cooking over a fire drifts across the tents. That is what an army marches on. But there was still one great mystery about the onion that nobody could explain. A mystery so basic that everyone had noticed it. But no one had cracked it. Why do onions make you cry? For thousands of years, nobody knew. Egyptian priests noticed it. Roman gladiators felt it. Medieval peasants dealt with it. Every human being who ever picked up a knife and cut into an onion had the same reaction. Their eyes stung. Their tears flowed. And nobody could say why. Chemists had chipped away at the puzzle for over a century. But the final piece didn't fall into place until 2002. That year, a team of Japanese researchers identified the specific enzyme responsible for creating the onion's tear-producing weapon. And with that discovery, a 5,000-year mystery finally had an answer. Here's what actually happens. It's simpler than the chemistry names make it sound. Step 1. You cut into the onion. That damage breaks open cells that were kept safely apart when the bulb was whole. Step 2. 2 ingredients that never used to meet now suddenly mix. An enzyme and a group of sulfur-containing molecules. Step 3. Their reaction produces a volatile gas. You don't need to remember its name. You already know exactly what it does. Step 4. That gas floats up from the cutting board. Step 5. It lands on the wet surface of your eye, And step 6, your brain does what it always does when your eyes are under chemical attack. It floods them with tears to wash the threat away. Here's what makes the discovery so extraordinary. That specific enzyme is almost unique to the onion. Garlic doesn't produce it. Chives barely do. Cut a whole bulb of garlic and your eyes stay dry. It's the onion, and almost only the onion, that carries this particular chemical alarm. And now the deeper question: why does the onion do this? The answer is evolutionary. That gas is a defense mechanism. In the wild, the onion is trying to protect itself from being eaten. When an animal bites into a wild onion, the gas floods its eyes and its nose. The animal drops the bulb. It walks away. It goes looking for something easier. The onion has been at chemical warfare with the natural world for millions of years. But here's what nobody could have predicted. Humans didn't run away. Humans looked at the plant that fought back, that stung our eyes and burned our tongues, and we decided we loved it. We planted more of it. We spread it across every continent. We built cities named after it. We paid our rent in it. We fed our armies with it. We buried our kings with it. And now go back to that mummy in the Valley of the Kings. We can't know exactly what the priests who prepared Ramses IV were thinking. Their beliefs about eternity, about the layered structure of the onion, about its preservative and antiseptic power, are what most archaeologists focus on. But it's hard not to notice something. In a culture obsessed with the awakening of the soul after death, they chose the one plant that reliably made a face weep. They placed it in the eyes of a king, then they closed the tomb, and they waited 3,000 years for someone to open it again. That someone was Grafton Elliott Smith in 1905. When he saw the onions where the eyes had once been, he had no way to fully understand what he was looking at. He recorded it, he photographed it, and he moved on to the next mummy. But we can understand it now. Those Egyptian priests were sending their king into eternity with the most powerful, most sacred, most protective plant they knew. And that plant is still with us. Today, the world grows more than 100 million tons of onions every year. India and China lead. Egypt, where this whole story began, is still one of the biggest producers on Earth. The same land that fed the pyramid builders is still growing the same crop 5,000 years later. So the next time you're standing at a cutting board with tears running down your face, think about what you're actually holding. A plant older than the pyramids, older than writing. It fed pharaohs. It rubbed the muscles of gladiators. It paid the rent of medieval peasants. It crossed the Atlantic in a wooden ship. It named an American city. It moved an army through a civil war. And it was placed in the eye sockets of a king because his priests believed it could carry him into forever. The onion isn't just food. It's one of the oldest quiet threads in the story of us, and it's still on your plate tonight. If you want more stories like this, hidden histories of ordinary things you'd never think twice about, subscribe. The next one is already coming. And the next time you cry over an onion, remember, you're crying with pharaohs.